Hi guys, today we're going to talk about Marxist theory and critical theories. So let's start with Marxist theory. This is a theory that gains conflict theory gains prominence in the 1960s, and it's sort of rooted in Marxist theory. If you guys recall from U.S. history, Marx is what communism is based in, although communism is slightly different from Marxist theory. Marxist theory wants to explain both criminal justice and the law, and it basically endorses a power elite model of society. And in this way, it's very similar to critical theory, or the conflict perspective of the criminal justice system. So here we're looking at how social, economic, and political power is concentrated in the hands of a very small select group. Capitalism, according to Marx, is a two-class system consisting of the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. So the bourgeoisie is a ruling class, and they own the means of production. And remember that when Marx is writing and theorizing, we're mainly an industrial, factory-driven society. The proletariat are the workers or masses, and what they do is they don't own the means of production, but they sell their labor. Because capitalists have a monopoly on the means of production, that allows them to control the political state. They can then use that to manipulate legal and justice system to promote their interests. Workers, however, find themselves in a position where they don't really have any ability to modify the fact that they're being oppressed. The only way the working class can change the situation is for them to overthrow the ruling class. Marx had predicted that there would be a workers' revolution. There was not a workers' revolution, however, because one thing that did come out of Marx's writings are a lot of the protections that most of us take for granted today in the workplace. So a limit on the number of hours you can work, being paid overtime, those sort of protections. Marx predicted that after the revolution, the proletariat would establish a socialist system, and that would evolve into a class-free communist system. There would be economic and social equality for everybody. There would be justice, and the political state would wither away because law would no longer be necessary. Pretty idealistic or utopian view of the world. Not particularly practical. Quinney, who's one of our broken windows theorists, proposes that conflicts exist in this amongst all of the variety of interests that society has. They're concentrated in basic underlying struggle between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. So we're all either members of the ruling class or the laborers. If we don't own the means of production, we're workers serving the bidding of the ruling elite. All real power and authority are exclusive and only belong to the ruling group, and their primary goals are to maintain the power position they have and continue the existing capitalist structure, because for them that's working. When they do this, they often promote interests that are not, or items or agendas that are not in the best interest of the working class. This means then that the bourgeoisie is constantly facing a constant crisis of legitimacy. Are they really legitimate? If the masses were ever to fully recognize their oppression, they would organize, revolt, and overthrow the system. Additionally, the ruling class is in charge of the media, intellectual and academic community, and other sources of public opinion. They use this to perpetuate an idea that their ideas are legitimate and therefore control the working class. So what is the Marxist theory of law and criminal justice? Well, they believe that the criminal justice system is used against the people, and that under capitalism, the criminal justice system is inherently unjust. So one of the things that they talk about is how the criminal justice system is also often used to regulate the labor market. So imprisonment, when we imprison people, we tend to do this more during periods where we have surplus labor. So at times, there are too many people, too many workers available for the economy to properly absorb them all. Those surplus laborers become a potential threat to capitalists because they could organize into this revolutionary movement that overthrows the ruling class. Imprisonment is a way to regulate then the availability and cost of labor. So Marxist predicts that during times of recession and high unemployment, we should see much higher imprisonment rates. Quinney argues that the criminal justice system is designed to repress the people, and that this is inevitable in a capitalist system. And the only way we can change this is to destroy the whole system. It is not possible to simply reform it. Marx argues we can only accomplish this through violent revolution, but Quinney says we could do it non-violently, and we could then replace our current form of government with a form of democratic socialism. Instrumentalist Marxism is similar to what Quinney has talked about. The political state is always and only an instrument of the capitalist class. This underwent strong criticism by other criminologists and resulted in an alternative structuralist model of Marxism. In response, Quinney and others then modified their position to adhere more closely to this structuralist model. Structuralists view the political state as having relative autonomy. The state is not totally under the control of the ruling class. Law is also not always just an instrument for promoting the interests of the ruling class. Many laws are passed that are directly counter to those people's, that ruling group's interests. And we also know that members of the ruling class are sometimes apprehended and punished. There may also be disagreements amongst that class and that group of people amongst what they think should be the current policies or laws. In terms of what's the difference between an instrumentalist and a structuralist Marxist, that's only something we see in the short run. They both agree that the long-term tendency of the criminal justice system is to protect the interests of the ruling class. In the short run, however, conflicts beyond, we're talking about conflicts beyond the classes. The more, however, we start to modify this theory so that it fits better, the more it starts to look like pluralistic conflict theory. So is this theory of, can Marxist theories be empirically supported? So one of the problems is they're often tautological, and it's often very dogmatic. It's a little more ideological and a little bit more in terms of, a little bit more political science than criminal justice. It doesn't give us a theory of law that we can really test. So Marxists argue that the criminal justice response to crime is affected by the political economy. That has been tested empirically. So some earlier hypotheses include that the elite will ensure high rates of imprisonment to control the labor surplus. So we can look at that. We can look at how does unemployment affect imprisonment. The evidence here, however, is contradictory. So during the Great Depression, the imprisonment rate was high. During the past 2 decades, we've had a lot of economic growth, and yet that's when we've had our greatest increase in the prison population. So it appears though we don't really have support for this, this element of Marxist theory. The strength of that unemployment-imprisonment correlation really depends on a relationship between capital, labor, and the state during each economic depression. When we control for other factors, that weak effect that does exist of unemployment on imprisonment disappears. So, as mentioned earlier, there's not a lot in Marxist theory that can really be tested empirically. And Marxists argue, well, that's okay because that's not how you evaluate our theory. Critics also argue that Marxist theorists are really only focusing on failings. This, however, does not mean that there's no validity. Just because something can't be tested doesn't mean it's not true. So, thinking about some things we might be seeing in our culture today that might support Marxist theory. So, the living standard of the middle and working class have been curtailed. The power of unions is decreasing. Yet the living standards of executives and owners of manufacturing and financial corporations remain the same. One of the problems also with Marxist theory is that they fail to make the proper comparisons between real socialist and real capitalist societies. So this is a little bit more ideological and theoretical, and isn't really focusing on what does an actual socialist society look like and an actual capitalist society look like. There's been some doubt raised about how accurate Marxist explanations for the operation of law are. Some capitalist societies have used police, courts, and prisons to repress the population. However, most open, free, democratic societies have not done so and do still have capitalist economies. Most Marxist regimes have also been totalitarian or authoritarian, and they have never really successfully progressed to a classless society. So what happens instead is, it's not necessarily that the means of production are owned by the elite, but the elite are still in a position of power. We've also seen that these communist regimes around the world have collapsed, and they have not been successful. Marxist theories of crime. Marx wrote virtually nothing about criminal behavior. He really focused on criminal law and the criminal justice system, but some theorists that are in the Marxist vein have sketched out some features of capitalism and how they might lead to criminal behavior. So one such criminologist is a Dutch criminologist named Bonger, and he says that crime is produced because of the capitalistic organization of society, that when people own the means of production and have private ownership, this produces greed and selfishness. As a result, man becomes more egoistic and therefore more capable of crime. Quinney talks about class, state, and crime. Bonger's theory didn't receive very much acceptance, and by the 1940s, American criminology is no longer really paying much attention to socialism. In the 70s, however, we have an intellectual boom, and we have some British scholars such as Taylor, Walton, and Young, and they're giving some scathing critiques of traditional theories of crime. They don't, however, provide a viable alternative to these other theories. Taylor says crime is one consequence of exploitation and oppression. He says that most proletariat lawbreakers are motivated to commit crimes in order to accommodate and survive the best they can in an unjust society. Others are committing crimes of rebellion, where they're basically acting out in a revolutionary manner. Quinney upheld the same view that crime is an inevitable response to the conditions of capitalism. He talks about crimes of resistance. These are predatory crimes which reproduce the capitalist system of acquiring property by basically stealing and taking the income and property of others. He also says violent crimes are crimes of accommodation by people who've been brutalized by the capitalist system. Michalowski talks about crimes of resistance and says that even crimes by the ruling class are a result of this capitalist system. He talks about crimes that are committed by capitalists in order to protect their own interests. These would be corporate crimes, so white-collar crimes, crimes committed by the criminal justice system itself or the personnel there, or by members of the government. Organized crime is also part of the capitalist class effort to ensure its domination of society. And sexism and racism are also means by which we maintain control over the working class. So Marxist theory has been modified throughout time. So some of these theorists have moved towards explanations of crimes that avoided oversimplification, one-cause approaches, and instead stress the effects of economic inequality on crime, how that creates a sense of alienation, how it leads to disorganized families, how it affects the way parents socialize, and other variables that when we think about them actually come from other theories such as strain and control theories. If you remember, your authors have talked about throughout these chapters that when we start to modify these theories so that they fit better, they start to look like other theories, and then they're no longer whatever theory they purport themselves to be. So if what we're really talking about here is strain and control theory, we're not talking about Marxist theory. Greenberg came a bit closer to presenting a specific theory of crime. He looked at the age crime curve, the age distribution of crime, and he said, how can we have so many juveniles involved in crime? And why can't current theory explain that? He says that this reflects the role that juveniles have played throughout history in the economic system. So juveniles in all social classes are generally deprived access to the labor market, and yet they still face pressure from their peers to possess and own certain things. They have no means to get to them, so they will turn to other means. But is that really Marxist, or is that an innovative approach and therefore strain theory? Colvin and Pauly talk about how parents socialize and discipline their children and how that reflects the kind of control that parents experience at work. So white-collar workers tend to develop strong internal moral norms, and they would socialize their kids in a similar fashion. Those who were workers on a lower rung are more used to coercion and manipulation, and they would treat their children similarly. Blue-collar workers usually use direct reward and punishment with their kids. Research does show some connection between school, family, and parental socialization, but again, this is not necessarily Marxist theory. There's been little empirical testing of this theory, and when it is tested, we find that this doesn't actually hold true. The type of work a parent has actually the weakest effect. The parts of this theory, as we mentioned already, that are most credible, that have the most support, come from social bonding theory, right? So this is not Marxist theory. So is crime the result of a capitalist economy? If this is true, right, and if capitalism is what leads to crime, then crime should be very low in socialist societies and very high in capitalist societies. So this is explaining not differences within the same society, but differences across societies. Marxists, however, haven't really spent much time looking at and comparing actual real societies. When people would point to and criticize their theory by saying, hey, guess what? The USSR, this former Soviet Union, fell apart and communism didn't work. They would say, well, that wasn't really truly socialist. So it's really difficult, even if we could get a better definition of what we mean by this, to actually compare different societies. Each society is not necessarily reporting this information in a way that we can readily access this data to compare these countries empirically. Some relevant comparisons can be made. We could consider types of crimes in two different political systems. So in socialist countries, we should see political dissent, joining and forming of unions, complaining about the government, not having a job. Those are all things that are illegal, and yet those are behaviors that are protected in Western democracies. Commission of those crimes is going to increase then the crime rate in the communist societies. Capitalist societies, crimes by private corporations are serious, yet in communism we don't have any private corporations. So as mentioned earlier, the lack of data makes it really difficult to compare this behavior. We have also seen that as the former communist countries renounce communism and move into new types of government, we do see an increase in crime. Maybe that's a result of changing to capitalism, but maybe it's the breakdown of a once highly restrictive law enforcement system. East Germany was fairly well able to merge with West Germany. And so there we didn't see as much of a problem. Even amongst developed capitalist nations, Western democracies, there's widely varying crime rates. If there was something about capitalism that was inherently criminogenic, then we should see the same problems. We should see similar crime rates. For most of the 20th century, property and violent crime was higher in the U.S., and in the past 2 decades, other countries have equaled or surpassed our rates. While our rates for motor vehicle theft, burglary, assault, and robbery have been falling, they remain higher in England. 2 crimes that remain higher in the U.S., however, are homicide and sexual assault. So this data does not support Marxist theory. What would be the policy implications? We would have to then apply Marxist theory through deliberate actions to bring about social change. Marxists argue that under socialism, material poverty would disappear, the profit motive would be eliminated, and the concern for the general well-being of the entire society would dominate over selfish privilege. This should reduce crime to negligible levels. The only policy implication we have here, though, is to eliminate capitalism. Any sort of reform is futile. We have to actually get rid of capitalism. Marxists have since muted their language, and they've called instead for things like equal justice in the bail system, getting rid of mandatory sentences, more focus on prosecution of corporate crimes, increasing employment opportunities, and promoting alternatives to imprisonment. These, however, are the same sort of reforms that are proposed by non-Marxist theorists. All right, critical criminology. Many criminologists use words like critical and radical as synonyms. Today we're more likely to see words like radical, critical, and leftist. Critical and radical are not fully synonymous with Marxist or Marxism, even though they're frequently used that way. So it's a little bit difficult to assess what even falls under the heading of Marxism. So due to the lack of clarity, we've got a couple of researchers here who are suggesting instead a different term called constitutive criminology. And this is basically looking at emerging perspectives such as chaos theory, catastrophe theory. Others have argued that it should also include things like critical race theory, queer theory, anarchism, peacemaking, prophetic criticism, socialist feminism, and postmodern feminism. So this is all stuff that's fairly heady. Also, when we look at this, well, is it very clear as to what does not constitute postmodernism? And I'm going to stop right here because I just realized we will be talking about conflict theory before you actually view this.